The Great Influenza, by John M. Barry. Introduction. Imagine a young scientist, a man so brilliant that his mentors, Nobel laureates among them, would later say he was the smartest person they had ever met. His name is Paul Lewis. It's September 1918, and he's been called to a naval hospital in Philadelphia to solve a mystery that has left seasoned doctors speechless. He walks into a ward filled not with men wounded by steel or explosives, but by something far stranger. Row after row of young sailors, the picture of strength and health just days before, are now writhing in agony. Blood is everywhere. It's not from wounds. It's pouring from their noses. Some are coughing it up. Others are bleeding from their ears. Their coughs are so violent that they're tearing their own abdominal muscles. And their skin is turning a strange shade of blue, so dark that it's hard to tell if a man is Caucasian or Negro. They look almost black. Lewis, a man who had dedicated his life to hunting death in a laboratory, had never seen anything like it. This wasn't a disease that crept in, it exploded. Despite the Navy's best efforts to isolate the sick, it was spreading like wildfire. What began as 19 sick sailors one day became 87 the next. 2 days later, it was 600. The hospital had run out of beds. Lewis believed he knew what it was. It was influenza. But an influenza unlike any ever seen before. This is the story of that disease. It's the story of the deadliest plague in human history, a pandemic that would kill more people than any other outbreak of disease ever. It killed more in a single year than the Black Death of the Middle Ages killed in a century. It killed more in 24 weeks than AIDS has killed in 24 years. But as John M. Barry reveals in his monumental book, The Great Influenza, this is more than just a story of death. It's the story of the first great collision between modern science and the raw power of nature. It's the story of a handful of remarkable men and women who stood against the storm, not with prayers or submission, but with the one weapon they believed could make a difference, the human mind. By the end of our time together, you'll understand not just what happened in 1918, but how it reshaped the very foundation of medicine and public health. You'll see how the struggle against this virus forced a revolution in how we think, how we lead, and how we face the unknown. And most importantly, you'll discover the timeless lesson at the heart of this story, that in a time of crisis, the most essential weapon we have is not just knowledge, but truth. Book summary. To truly understand the story of the 1918 influenza, you have to understand that it didn't just happen to the world. It happened to a very specific world. A world where medicine itself was in the middle of a revolution. For over 2,000 years, from the time of Hippocrates, the practice of medicine had barely changed. Doctors believed the body was governed by 4 fluids, or humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Sickness was simply an imbalance of these humors. If you had a fever and your skin was flushed, the logic was simple: you had too much blood. The solution? Bleeding. For centuries, the lancet, a small sharp tool used to cut into a vein, was a doctor's most common instrument. This wasn't superstition. It was based on pure reason, on observation and logic. But it was a logic that never truly tested its own assumptions. Doctors observed nature, but they didn't probe it. They didn't experiment. Then, in the 19th century, a new way of thinking began to emerge, first in Europe. Scientists in Paris and Germany started doing something radical. They began to count. A French physician named Pierre-Louis started keeping detailed records, comparing patients who were bled with those who weren't. His conclusion, based on simple arithmetic, was stunning. Bleeding patients didn't help. It was useless. Slowly, the old world of medicine began to crumble. New tools like the stethoscope, the microscope, and the thermometer allowed doctors to see and measure the body in objective ways. They began to see disease not as a systemic imbalance, but as a specific invader that attacked specific parts of the body. This was a revolutionary idea. But in the United States, this revolution was slow to arrive. American medicine was, to put it simply, backward. In the late 1800s, it was harder to get into a good college than into most American medical schools. Many schools required no high school diploma, let alone any training in science. You could become a doctor just by attending a few lectures, and you could graduate without ever having touched a single patient. Oliver Wendell Holmes, the physician father of the famous Supreme Court justice, once declared that if the entire collection of medicines then in use could be sunk to the bottom of the sea, it would be all the better for mankind and all the worse for the fishes. Into this world came a handful of men who were determined to change everything. Their story, in many ways, begins with one man, William Henry Welch. Welch was born into a family of doctors, but as a young man, he found medicine repugnant. Only after failing to secure a teaching position in Greek at Yale did he reluctantly turn to the family profession. But he decided to do it his own way. Instead of just apprenticing and attending lectures, he went to Europe, to the great German laboratories where a new world was opening up. There, he learned from the masters, men who were pioneering the new science of bacteriology. He learned a new way to think, to trust nothing but experiment, to sit down before a fact as a little child, and follow wherever nature leads. When he returned to America, he brought that fire with him. In 1893, he became one of the founding professors of a radical new institution, the Johns Hopkins University School of Medicine. Hopkins was designed to be unlike any other medical school in America. It was modeled on the great German universities, dedicated not just to teaching old knowledge but to creating new knowledge through relentless research. Its standards were unheard of. It required a college degree for admission and fluency in French and German, so students could read the latest scientific literature. Students didn't just listen to lectures, they worked in laboratories and examined patients in the hospital wards from their very first year. Welch was the perfect man for this revolution. He wasn't a genius in the lab himself, he made no single magnificent discovery, but he had an almost supernatural ability to spot genius in others. He was an impresario, a builder, a man who, as one colleague said, could transform men's lives almost by the flick of a wrist. He assembled a faculty of brilliant young scientists, men like the surgeon William Halsted, who revolutionized surgery, and the clinician William Osler, whose textbook would become the Bible of medicine. Together, this small band of warriors, as Barry calls them, created an army. They trained a new generation of scientists who fanned out across the country, transforming other medical schools, Harvard, Penn, Michigan, in the Hopkins image. At the same time, John D. Rockefeller, inspired by Osler's book, founded the Rockefeller Institute for Medical Research in New York, with Welch as its guiding force and his protégé, Simon Flexner, as its director. For the first time, American medicine wasn't just catching up to Europe, it was preparing to surpass it. This new scientific army was focused, disciplined, and ready for a war. They were preparing for the eruption of a major epidemic, which they knew was inevitable during the Great War. They stockpiled vaccines and antitoxins. They designed mobile laboratory railcars that could be rushed to any outbreak. They thought they were ready. They had no idea what was coming. The enemy didn't emerge from the battlefields of Europe. The evidence John Barry lays out is compelling. It most likely emerged from the flat, treeless plains of Haskell County, Kansas, in January 1918. Drive. Loring Minor, a country doctor who loved Greek classics but ate peas with his knife, noticed something strange. A new and violent illness was sweeping through his patients. It looked like influenza, but it was terrifyingly intense. It struck down the strongest, healthiest people in the county, killing them with stunning speed. Worried, Miner did something no one else in the country was doing. He formally warned the U.S. Public Health Service about an influenza of severe type. His was the only such report in the nation. In a sparsely populated place like Haskell, the virus might have burned itself out. But this was wartime. Young men from Haskell County were constantly traveling to and from Camp Funston, a massive Army training base 300 miles away. On March 4, just days after several men arrived from Haskell, the first soldier at Funston reported sick with influenza. Within 3 weeks, over 1,100 soldiers were in the hospital. Camp Funston was like a pump, sending a constant stream of men to other bases across America and to the battlefields of France. The virus traveled with them. A mild first wave of influenza swept across the United States and Europe in the spring of 1918. It made many sick, but it killed few. In fact, it was so mild that some doctors writing in the prestigious medical journal The Lancet argued it couldn't be influenza because it was so harmless. But the virus wasn't harmless. It was adapting. To understand what happened next, you have to understand the nature of the influenza virus. It is what scientists call a mutant swarm. Unlike more stable organisms, an RNA virus like influenza makes countless mistakes when it replicates. Most of these mutations are useless, but some can change its very nature. When a virus passes from one host to another, it can become more efficient at infecting, and often, more deadly. The virus that emerged in the spring was like an apprentice killer. As it passed through millions of soldiers and civilians across the world that summer, it was honing its skills. It was learning how to kill with brutal efficiency. It was evolving. And then, in late August, in 3 separate port cities across the globe, Brest, France, Freetown, Sierra Leone, and Boston, Massachusetts, the master killer revealed itself. The second wave had begun. This time, it was different. In Boston, sailors at Commonwealth Pier began dying. The disease exploded into Camp Devens, a nearby Army base. A doctor there wrote to a friend, "These men start with what appears to be an ordinary attack of la grippe, and when brought to the hosp, they very rapidly develop the most vicious type of pneumonia that has ever been seen. A few hours later you can begin to see the cyanosis extending from their ears and spreading all over the face, until it is hard to distinguish the colored men from the white. It is only a matter of a few hours then until death comes. It is horrible." The morgues overflowed. Bodies were stacked like cordwood. William Welch, the great leader of American medicine, was rushed to the camp. He walked into the autopsy room and saw lungs so full of blood and fluid that they were heavy and sodden. The sight so disturbed him that he, a man who had seen everything, turned to his colleagues and said, "This must be some new kind of infection or plague." It wasn't plague. It was just influenza. But it was an influenza that was triggering a devastating overreaction from the immune system. The young and healthy, who had the strongest immune systems, were ironically the most vulnerable. Their bodies launched a massive counterattack against the virus, a cytokine storm that flooded the lungs with fluid and debris, destroying the very tissue they were supposed to protect. Victims were, in effect, drowning in their own bodily fluids. Their lungs were being ripped apart. As the virus exploded, society began to break down. This happened in a country that was singularly unprepared to face it, because its entire focus was on something else, winning the war. President Woodrow Wilson had forged the United States into a weapon. He created a vast government propaganda machine, the Committee on Public Information, led by a man named George Creel, whose goal was to create one white-hot mass of war enthusiasm. To preserve morale, truth became the first casualty. Newspapers, under intense pressure from the government and their own self-censorship, printed nothing that might hurt the war effort. So, as the epidemic began to sweep the nation, officials and the press systematically downplayed the danger. In Philadelphia, 300 sailors from Boston arrived at the Navy Yard on September 7. Within days, hundreds were sick. Yet the city's public health director, Wilmer Cruson, assured the public there was no danger. Doctors pleaded with him to cancel a massive Liberty Loan parade scheduled for September 28, warning it would spread the disease like wildfire. Cruson refused. The parade was essential for war morale. 200,000 people packed the streets of Philadelphia for the parade. 72 hours later, every single bed in every one of the city's 31 hospitals was full. In the first day after the incubation period, 117 people died. The next day, it was more. The day after that, even more. Soon, hundreds were dying every day. But newspapers and officials kept lying. The peak of the influenza epidemic has been reached, they declared one day, only to see the death toll double the next. The lies bred terror. People couldn't trust what they were told, so they trusted nothing. Fear became its own epidemic. In a city where 500,000 people were sick, society began to implode. People were afraid to leave their homes. They were afraid to help their neighbors. A Red Cross worker pleaded, "Hundreds of women have been told that there are families in which every member is ill, in which the children are actually starving because there is no one to give them food. The death rate is so high and they still hold back." There were no doctors. There were no nurses. Most horrifyingly, there were no coffins and no one to dig graves. Bodies piled up in homes for days, on porches, in hallways. Priests began driving horse-drawn wagons down the streets, calling for people to bring out their dead, just as they had during the bubonic plague. The city was forced to use steam shovels to dig mass graves. Philadelphia was not alone. The story repeated itself across the nation and across the world. A doctor in Wellington, New Zealand, described his city as a city of the dead. A train leaving an infected army camp in Illinois became a rolling coffin, with nearly a quarter of the troops taken directly to a hospital upon arrival. From the ice of the Arctic to the jungles of Africa, the virus hunted mankind. In some remote villages in Alaska, so many died so quickly that there was no one left to feed the sled dogs, which, maddened by hunger, broke into homes and devoured the dead. In all of human history, there had never been a death toll like it. An estimated 675,000 Americans died. Worldwide, the number was likely between 50 and 100 million people. While society was collapsing, that small cadre of scientists was racing against time. They had to find the cause of the disease. Was it the bacterium Richard Pfeiffer had discovered in the 1890s and named Bacillus influenza? Or was it something else, something they couldn't see, a filterable virus? Laboratories across the country became war zones. Scientists like Paul Lewis in Philadelphia, William Park and Anna Williams in New York, and Oswald Avery at the Rockefeller Institute worked around the clock, surrounded by death, trying to isolate the killer. At first, many believed it was Pfeiffer's bacillus. Vaccines were rushed into production based on this assumption. Lewis, Park, and others poured all their energy into creating something, anything, that could stop the killing. But Oswald Avery, the quiet, obsessive hunter in the laboratory, wasn't so sure. He was a man who thrived on disappointment, who believed in digging one deep hole rather than collecting surface nuggets. In the midst of the chaos, he refused to be rushed. His experiments were telling him something different. He found Pfeiffer's bacillus, yes, but not always. And sometimes he found lungs devastated by the disease with no bacteria in them at all. The pandemic eventually burned itself out. The virus mutated again, this time toward its mean, becoming less lethal. And those who survived had immunity. But the scientific quest did not end. It took more than a decade of painstaking work to finally prove the answer. In 1931, Richard Shope, a brilliant young scientist who had worked under Paul Lewis, proved that a similar disease in swine was caused by a virus. Then, in 1933, British scientists, following Shope's methods, finally isolated the human influenza virus. Pfeiffer had been wrong. The scientists who had raced to make vaccines against his bacillus had been chasing a ghost. But the story doesn't end there. The legacy of the pandemic was profound. It spurred the creation of modern public health systems around the world. It led to the founding of the National Institutes of Health. And it set Oswald Avery on a path that would lead to one of the most important discoveries of the 20th century. Driven by the questions raised during the pandemic, Avery returned to his obsession, the pneumococcus bacterium, a major cause of the pneumonia that killed so many influenza victims. He became fascinated by how a harmless, non-lethal strain of the bacteria could somehow be transformed into a deadly one. For years, he worked in near-total obscurity, publishing nothing between 1934 and 1944. Then, in 1944, he and his colleagues published a paper that changed the world. He had found the transforming principle. He had proven that the substance that carried genetic information, the very blueprint of life, was not protein, as nearly all scientists believed. It was a simple molecule called DNA. He started by hunting the cause of a plague, and he ended by discovering the secret of life itself. He never won a Nobel Prize, but his discovery paved the way for Watson and Crick and the entire field of molecular biology. It was a strange and powerful testament to the idea that even in the face of unimaginable devastation, the relentless pursuit of knowledge can lead us to places we never thought possible. Commentary. When you close a book like The Great Influenza, you're left with a kind of quiet awe. It's not just the scale of the tragedy, which is almost impossible to comprehend, but the profound lessons it holds about science, leadership, and human nature. The first, and perhaps most powerful, lesson is about the nature of truth. In 1918, the leaders of the United States made a deliberate choice. They decided that morale was more important than truth. They believed that by reassuring the public, by telling them that this was only influenza or the same old grip, they could prevent panic and keep the war machine running. But their lies had the opposite effect. Because what people saw with their own eyes, the wagons piled with bodies, the crepe on their neighbors' doors, was so terrifyingly different from what they were being told, they lost all trust in authority. And when trust evaporates, society begins to fracture. Fear fills the vacuum. People stop helping one another. They isolate themselves. That's what happened in 1918. The lies didn't prevent panic, they amplified it. They created a terror that was, in its own way, as destructive as the virus itself. The simple, brutal lesson is this: you don't manage a crisis by managing information. You manage it by telling the truth. Because in the face of a terrifying reality, the only thing that gives people a fighting chance is a clear-eyed understanding of what they are up against. The second lesson is about the scientific process itself. We often think of science as a series of neat aha moments, but this book shows it for what it really is: a slow, messy, frustrating, and deeply human struggle. In the midst of the pandemic, even the best scientists in the world were forced to make educated guesses. Men like Paul Lewis and William Park, acting under immense pressure, chased the wrong culprit, Pfeiffer's bacillus, because it was the most logical suspect. Their efforts, though heroic, were ultimately futile. But then you have someone like Oswald Avery. He embodies the true spirit of scientific inquiry. He wasn't the fastest or the flashiest. He was the most patient. He had the courage to embrace uncertainty, to admit he didn't know, and to keep digging even when everyone else thought the case was closed. He reminds us that true breakthroughs rarely come from a single stroke of genius. They come from persistence. They come from the discipline to follow the evidence, no matter how strange or inconvenient, and from the quiet confidence to trust the process, even when it feels like you're getting nowhere. So, what can we take away from this story today? The first step is a simple one, and it's something the doctors in 1918 would have agreed with. When you feel sick, stay home. Rest. It was the best advice then, and it's still the best advice now. It protects you, and it protects others. But the deeper action is a mental one. This book is a powerful reminder to cultivate a healthy skepticism for official narratives, especially in a crisis. It teaches us to question reassurances that feel disconnected from reality. It encourages us to seek out the data, to listen to the experts who are willing to say we don't know, and to value the unvarnished truth above comforting lies. It shows us that true resilience, whether in a society or in our own lives, doesn't come from pretending things are fine. It comes from facing the facts, however grim, and then moving forward with clarity and determination. That was a summary of The Great Influenza by John M. Barry. We've certainly covered a lot of ground today, but I have to be honest with you. A summary, even a detailed one, is like looking at a map of the Grand Canyon. It can show you the shape and the scale, but it can't make you feel the wind on your face or the sheer breathtaking immensity of standing on the edge. The real power of this book is in the stories, in the details, in the way Barry makes you feel the chill of that hospital ward in 1918. This summary is meant to be a guide, to help you decide if this journey is one you want to take. If anything we've discussed today has sparked your curiosity or given you a moment of pause, then I'd truly encourage you to pick up a copy. Reading it isn't just about learning history. It's about understanding the very fabric of our modern world and the timeless struggle between humanity and nature. You can find a link to the book in the description below. And, if you found this summary valuable, I'd be grateful if you'd take a moment to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. It lets me know that these deep dives are helpful, and it ensures you won't miss our next exploration of another world-changing book from the billionaire's bookshelf. Let's keep learning and growing together.